As our educational disciplines advance throughout time, Christianity becomes almost impossible to ignore. In our modern culture, the Old Testament narratives are viewed as mythological at best and probably more like fairy tales. However, as archaeologists continue to excavate the setting that the biblical narrative takes place in, they discover more and more real historical links to Scripture. Recent discoveries include references to the house of King David, the pool of Siloam where Jesus performed miracles, evidence of Pontius Pilate during the time that Jesus was crucified, and much, much more. And now we have evidence not only of the existence of the famous sin cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but we even have some evidence of their supernatural destruction. I was first made aware of this conversation through a Christian YouTuber I really like, Ruslan KD. You should check him out. He does an incredible job. I've actually mirrored a lot of what I'm doing on here. I feel like I have a unique perspective and a unique take from him. But man, he does a fantastic job. And I saw this clip first, and the clip is from Pints with Aquinas. Now, this is a Catholic theologian. And of course, I am not a Catholic. There are many, many, many areas of disagreement between me and Catholicism. But this actual clip has nothing to do with the Catholic faith. This is a conversation with an archaeologist named John Bergsma. I'm pretty sure that's how you say his last name. And to kind of set up the clip that we're going to look at, Dr. John was at kind of a symposium, and he saw one of the rooms was a conversation on the lost cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, if you don't know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, these were twin cities during the time of Abraham who were known to be outlandishly wicked. And God told Abraham he was going to destroy them with fire, like rain fire from heaven, and completely wipe out these cities. And Abraham kind of bargained with God and was like, if I can find 10 good people in there, will you spare the city? There were not even 10 good people. And so there's a lot more to the story, but they were steeped in sexual immorality. They were arrogant. They were lazy. They were prideful. They like fully embraced all of the 7 deadly sins. And listen, we are all sinners, but there is a big difference and a big disconnect between sinning and viewing it as sin and despising your sin, repenting of it, changing your mind, getting help, and seeking holiness, even though you'll do it imperfectly and you will continue sinning along the way, more and more over time being fashioned into the image of Christ. That's very different than embracing your sin. And woe to him who calls what is good evil and what is evil good. And that was the state of Sodom and Gomorrah. They fully clung to their sin as a part of their culture and a part of their life. And God did, in fact, destroy it in the biblical narrative. Now, people who think everything in the biblical narrative is just fairy tale, man, this certainly is one of those. Like that God just sent a heavenly nuclear bomb and took these places out seems way too far-fetched. Like I could maybe believe there was someone named Abraham. I believe in the historical figure of Jesus. Maybe there was a King David. We have some, but God wiping out with fire from heaven these 2 specific cities, it's just too far-fetched. So it caught this archaeologist, Dr. John, it caught his attention. He went in and they began talking about what they believe is Sodom and Gomorrah and how it's just been completely wiped out. So at the end, they got to ask questions. And the question he asked was, did you find any arrowheads in the cities? And he explains the reason he asked that question is because if there are arrowheads, then the people were obviously wiped out by means of war. And the guy who was giving the lecture got a little bit gun shy and said there were no arrowheads. And I don't want to say much more, but what I will say is that this was a heat event. And so we'll pick up the video right there.
This destruction layer of this city that we're beginning to think is Sodom. And we pulled up a piece of pottery. And when I looked on one side of it, I thought, oh no, our research is ruined, because I saw that it was glazed. And glazing wasn't invented until the Ottoman period, or at least the kind of glazing that he thought he saw. And the Ottoman period is like 1000 AD. And if you're pulling that up, that means you've got contamination in your archaeological dig. You got like later artifacts down there. But then he turned the pottery over, and on the back of it, it was typical Bronze Age pottery, but it was glazed on one side and not on the other. Like, what on earth is going on? So make a long story short, he sends this away to a lab in the US and for testing, and they come back and say, well, that glazing is trinitite. Okay, great. What's trinitite? Well, trinitite is that glass layer that you get when you basically set off an atomic bomb in the desert, and it melts the glass, and you get the kind of crystalline formation that's called trinitite. So this pottery was raised to over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit for a brief moment of time.
Okay, so just so we're tracking the conversation, what he's saying is, as they are excavating this site, they lose hope for a minute because they see what they think is evidence of contamination of the site. Now, the cities are located like exactly where they are said to be in scripture. They have all the markings. They're really convinced it's Sodom and Gomorrah. But just because you find what might be Sodom and Gomorrah does not mean that you have found evidence of a divine judgment of like a nuclear level of fire raining from heaven. Now they turn this over. They see a glazing on there, like a glass on there that could not have been from all the way back in Abraham's time. And they get, really kind of disappointed, because if there is tampering inside of an excavation site, then a lot of your research kind of goes out the window, and the conclusions you're able to draw really, really fall off a cliff. They send it off, and it turns out that what that is coded in would have required these cities that they already believed to be Sodom and Gomorrah to have been heated up to at least 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit in a moment in time. And there's even more evidence for this actually lining up with the biblical narrative.
Like, oh my gosh, this is what's going on. So they continue to bring up this glazed pottery, and eventually what they discover is, among other things, they also begin to find human remains. They find human skeletons that are complete up until about halfway up the backbone, and then there's just a scorch mark, and there's nothing on the top of the body. And they find the skeleton behind a wall that's about 4 feet high. So what's going on here? Well, long story short, they find massive evidence that a huge heat blast from the sky at about 25 degrees above the horizon incinerated these twin cities on the Jordanian side of the river, just north of the Dead Sea. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what the evidence points to. He goes on that the entire conversation is quite fascinating. And one of the reasons that this continues to bring more and more evidence for taking the scripture seriously, and maybe even literally, is because we already have all of these different disciplines that are continuing to grow in their efficacy and their knowledge. Science, history, sociology, neurology, meteorology, all of these different disciplines, educational disciplines, they continue as they advance and as they grow to seem in many regards to be catching up to the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000-year-old texts of scripture. And archaeology, especially recently with advances in archaeology, it seems multiple times a year, every year, to be finding historical evidence that links archaeology to the narrative of scripture. The dates are lining up, the narratives are lining up, the characters, the people in the right places that plug into the stories, just like in scripture. And one of the things that Christians have pointed to for a very long time is that there is internal cohesion across scripture too. Significantly, if you are a believer, Jesus mentions Sodom and Gomorrah in Matthew 10:15. He says, "Truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town." He's talking about a coming future judgment, and he uses Sodom and Gomorrah and the insane judgment that happened to them, which we now have actual physical scientific evidence of. And that's significant because Jesus also mentioned Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, King David, Jonah, Isaiah, Elijah, Elisha, and Daniel. Jesus mentions all of these people. And the question is he using these as metaphors or allegory? And to be fair, each of those would have to be looked at in their specific context to make some of those conclusions. But the normative way Jesus is talking is as if he's speaking of historical figures. That is how he is speaking of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's how he's speaking of these other biblical characters from the Old Testament. And now we're seeing proof that Sodom and Gomorrah were real places that actually came under a severe incineration of fire from heavens, from the heavens, right? Whether you think it's actually heaven and God, that's up to you, but from the heavens as they were understood at that time. As our educational disciplines advance throughout time, Christianity becomes almost impossible to ignore. And one of the areas we've really seen this in is cosmology. And cosmology tries to answer, like, why is there something rather than nothing? And where did all of this come from? And the more we understand, going back even to Einstein's theory of relativity, which was corrected by the Hubble telescope in the 1920s or 1930s, when we were able to see the red glow radiation at the very edges of our universe expanding across time, which leads to the scientific conclusion that if you reverse the clock, all of that would condense back into nothing. That's where you get the Big Bang from. I grew up, this is how science progresses. I grew up in churches that said the Big Bang is anti-theism. It's against God. It's against Christianity. When in fact, when rightly understood, science is catching up with Scripture. And the Big Bang is some of the clearest evidence for the necessity of an uncaused cause that is matterless, that is timeless, that is all-powerful, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful, personal, because this uncaused cause made a decision to go from nothing to something. All the scientific evidence points that before our universe, there was nothing, and now there is all of this, and nothing actually means nothing. And now all of this is here, which means either all of this came from nothing or all of this came from something. That's something that we call God. And so science begins to prove theism. And so what happens is those who are desperate to suppress the truth is they begin to come up with more theories, multiversal theories, which have only theoretical, philosophical thought behind them, no tangible evidence at all. But we push them forward, and now we're putting them in all of our movies, and we're continuing to do more and more speculative work on them instead of looking at the actual data that we have from the world we live in and from our universe. We have the matrix theory, the simulation theory, where we're all just plugged in. We have the cyclical theory, where there's been all kinds of big bangs that go all the way back to infinity, ignoring the philosophical problems with infinity, like infinite regress. The more our educational disciplines advance, the more we learn about neurology, the more we learn that the world's way of doing things, of putting yourself first and climbing the ladder and knocking people over and not being humble and living in your pride, that doesn't work. Everyone's lived like that forever, but neurologically, the thing that actually helps you thrive is to live exactly how Jesus told us to live, to put others before ourselves, to serve others humbly, to suffer intentionally. Like, if you are willing to take on suffering for an actual purpose, you will live the best life possible. It's what Jesus said. He said to follow me, deny yourself every day. Don't give in to your base desires. Don't be prideful. Don't be lustful. Take up your cross, suffer intentionally for the purpose of others, and then follow the path that Jesus followed, the most significant life ever. Here's what Paul wrote in 2 Timothy. Perfect. 2 Timothy 3. All scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, for rebuking, for correcting, for training in righteousness. All scripture is breathed out by God. It's inspired by God. And you don't have to believe that, but the more time goes on, the more difficult it is to not believe it. And not because the preachers are getting better at preaching, or not because we're writing better theological books, because everything in this world points back to God. And if there is a God who created the universe, he also created the reason and logic that sustain this universe. And so the more we learn logically and reasonably, the more all things will point back to the reality of a God who does love us, who did create us, and has an actual purpose for us. I hope you enjoyed this clip from the Clayton Tyner podcast. If you want to watch the full podcast, you can check that out somewhere right around here. And if you want to subscribe, you can do that right over here somewhere. Also, you can follow me at Clayton Tyner. That's Tyner on Twitter and Instagram. I would love for you to subscribe to the channel so you can keep up with everything that we're doing.